Welcome and greetings from Charlottesville, Virginia. Thank you for joining the University of Virginia Democracy Initiative's Memory Project for our launch event today, this afternoon. I'm Jalane Schmidt, Associate Professor of Religious Studies at the University of Virginia, and I'm the Director of the Memory Project. The University of Virginia Democracy Initiative integrates research, teaching, and public engagement on democracy by bringing together a diverse range of scholars, government leaders, practitioners to study and advance the prospects of democracy in the United States and around the world. Within the Democracy Initiative, the Memory Project is dedicated to the study of how memory is produced and reproduced. And we do this by participating in and catalyzing memory work with our community partners. The Memory Project provides support for different educational initiatives, media production, the arts, public history, and commemorative events. The Memory Project is pleased to host this afternoon's launch event, Memorializing Racial Trauma, What Americans Can Learn from the Germans. We'll listen to our guest, Dr. Susan Neiman, who I'll introduce in just a minute, as she reflects upon what German commemorative practices have to teach US memory work. Our moderator, Michele Norris, will guide today's conversation with our guest and channel audience questions during the latter portion of the event. There are a lot of you watching our virtual event today, and we want to have some audience interaction. We invite you to submit questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. In addition, there will be poll questions throughout the event, and we hope that you can register some of your responses to the questions that are asked. Now for our speakers. Dr. Susan Niemann was born in Atlanta, Georgia, and studied philosophy at Harvard University and the Freie Universität Berlin. And she is speaking to us today from her home in Berlin, actually. Dr. Niemann was professor of philosophy at Yale and Tel Aviv universities before becoming director of the Einstein Forum, a German interdisciplinary public think tank, in the year 2000. She's the author of 8 books, most recently, Learning from the Germans, Race and the Memory of Evil. Niemann is the mother of 3 grown children. Michele Norris is an award-winning journalist and one of the most recognized voices on radio. For a decade, she was the host of National Public Radio's All Things Considered, and she invites people to share their 6-word essays on her Peabody Award-winning The Race Card Project. As a Washington Post opinions columnist, Norris engages audiences in candid discussions of race, culture, and communication in America. So just to kind of set the context for our event today, we're very conscious this afternoon of the need for memorializing racial trauma. The trial continues of the policeman who's charged with murdering George Floyd, an unarmed Black civilian from Minneapolis. And it was this event that set off a nationwide wave of protests and demands for racial justice in the summer of 2020. Sadly, in nearby Brooklyn Center, Minnesota, yet another young Black man, Daunte Wright, was killed several days ago by a police officer in what officials happily describe as an accidental shooting. In the United States, we're still reckoning with centuries of ongoing racial trauma, and we need to reflect upon how we memorialize this history. And so this question of how to work off the past, and our speaker, Susan Neiman, has introduced an American audience to that wonderful German compound word, Vergangenheitsaufarbeitung, this working off of the past. So this need to work off the past has gained urgency nationally here in the United States, particularly after the 2015 white supremacist massacre in Charleston, South Carolina, and then the 2017 Unite the Right rally right here in downtown Charlottesville, Virginia. Debates were reignited about Confederate symbolism in public spaces, particularly, in the past several years and with even more urgency in the past year. Currently, the United States Department of Defense is in the process of renaming military bases that are named for Confederate figures, while in Virginia's state capital of Richmond, the former capital of the Confederacy, the governor is awaiting a state Supreme Court ruling on his attempt to take down a towering Confederate monument. Very close to home here at the University of Virginia, we also struggle to work off the past. Several years ago, jettisoning century-old plaques which had honored UVA's Confederate affiliates from the walls of the institution's iconic rotunda. And as we wrangle with all this, we see across the Atlantic examples in Germany of how to honestly confront the traumas of the past. And so I wonder, Susan, if you can tell us, what do the differences between Germany's commemoration of World War II and commemoration of the Civil War in the US South tell us about the status of democracy in Germany and America?
I'm happy to answer that. I do want to first thank you for inviting me to help launch this project. I have followed from a distance what people in Charlottesville have been doing since the murderous Unite the Right demonstration in 2017, and I'm honored if I can contribute to your efforts. I've been having a little trouble today thinking about how we commemorate the violence of the past when it's still going on in the present. And I don't have anything really helpful to say about that. I am speechless that in the middle of the trial of George Floyd's murderer, another young Black man was killed in a traffic stop 10 miles away. So, I mean, perhaps I can just express a word of sorrow, not only for the family of Daunte Wright, but for the nation in which Black people continue to be murdered in this way. In fact, I was trying to think of whether I could contribute to Michele's race card project and how I would compress something into 6 words. But I think if I had 6 words, it would be, whites don't give children the talk. And that's probably the greatest expression of white privilege. We all worry about our children. So many things can happen to them. You know, they can fall in with the wrong crowd. They can get into drugs. They can do all the right things and still get hit by a drunk driver. But I never had to warn my children about what to do if they're stopped by the police. And it's well, like I say, it sometimes makes me speechless. It makes me speechless when, despite the greatest protests in the history of the country last summer, the number of Black people murdered by the cops continues to grow. It's, yeah, okay. But let me try and switch gears, although it's been a bit hard today following at the news. I'm not sure that the differences between Germany and the US are really reflections of democracy. Can I have somebody on screen to look at here? Just because it's weird talking to a blank page, a blank picture. I think the first thing that Americans can learn from the Germans is how very, very hard it is to look at your national crimes in the face. Nobody wants to do it. And when I've talked about this book to not only to Americans, but to people in other countries, they're astonished to find that it took the Germans 40 years to get out of their self-conception as the greatest victims of World War II. And that should shock us because, of course, we look at the Nazis as the incarnation of evil, and we assume that the moment the war was over, they fell on their knees and asked the world to forgive them. Really, almost nothing of the sort happened. And perhaps the most interesting thing that I found in my research was that the kinds of things that post-war West Germans in particular said in the first 4 decades after the war mirrored exactly the kinds of things that defenders of the lost cause like to say. You know, our men were just defending their homeland, and so many of them were killed, wounded, or in POW camps. We lost so many people. Our cities were in ashes and ruins. And on top of that, the Americans, or the Yankees, blamed us for starting the war. Exactly this, you know, in the South, it is still called the War of Northern Aggression, and there were still many Germans who wanted to tell themselves that the war was not their fault. It took them 40 years. And it was a long, slow process in East Germany, because the leaders of communist East Germany were genuine anti-fascists who had spent the war either in concentration camps or in exile, otherwise they would have been killed. You had a kind of top-down, we're going to do monuments to the heroes, we're going to renovate the Buchenwald concentration camp and make every school child visit it, we're going to redo the lesson plans. They didn't do it perfectly, and they instrumentalized some of it, but you did have a consistent desire to acknowledge that the Nazis were criminals and that defeating them was liberation. You did not have that in the West. You had what was sometimes called, there was a philosopher who called it communicative silence. No one wanted to talk about the war. Some people say that was part of the economic miracle. I mean, the economic miracle wasn't exactly a miracle either. It involved an awful lot of money from the Marshall Plan, but people's homes were in ruins, or they were homeless. There was an enormous amount of energy put into simply building up the physical ruins, and no one wanted to talk about the moral ruins, which were there. Late in the 50s, you had a few intellectuals, artists, and church groups insist that we were guilty and there's something that we need to do about it. And that was a movement that built up somewhat slowly over time, until finally, one has to say, in 1985 was an important moment in the German history of working off the past, which I actually think is as important as President Obama's speech in Charleston when the 9 churchgoers were murdered, because that was the first time that a national figure made this connection between our ignorance of the violence of the past and the continuation of violence in the present. And you had that from the president of Germany, of West Germany, finally in 1985. The German working off the past has by no means been perfect. It's still being worked on intensely. There are lots of debates about the way it's been done and the way that it could be done better. But at the very least, they did several things which Americans can learn from. First of all, they recognized that facing your criminal past is necessary for a country to be healthy and to become strong. And it's not a confession of weakness. It can be a road to strength, to have a more nuanced history and acknowledge, you know, the criminals in your past, while also finding new heroes, which I think is a very important part of American debates about memorialization. That is not just what monuments we take down, but what we put up and who we honor. And my hope is that that is a community. I know most of the arguments have been focused on who we take down. I think it's at least as important for communities to discuss who are the people that we would like to look up to, who hold the values that we want our children to hold in the 21st century. So, and that is something that was recognized. The second thing that the Germans recognized is that this is a multi-layered process. It has to take place on, you know, there isn't a quick fix. It doesn't take place by, taking down one monument or 60 monuments or putting up another. It has to work on multiple levels. It has to work through education. And education is not just something that takes place in the schools. It's something that takes place through popular culture. And the other thing that I think we need to recognize from the Germans, or we can learn from the Germans, is this is a multi-generational project. It's not going to take place overnight. This is something that our children will still be working on, perhaps their children less so. But our children will certainly be rooting out the vestiges of racism and of hatred and resentment and the ways in which that seeps into the culture that we inhabit. So how's that for a start?
Well, Susan, that was wonderful. Jalane, do you have anything else you want to add to that?
No, I want to hear more.
Well, Jalane, thank you very much for bringing us together for this conversation, which feels essential in this moment. And even though we're talking about difficult things, I think it may feel a bit like balm in that we are seeing a path forward for a country that is almost like the home of the brave and the land of the free and also the land of amnesia. We have a hard time facing up to a difficult past. I'm honored to have this conversation with you, Susan, and very honored to be a part of this inaugural effort as the Memory Project moves forward. Before we begin, I just want to invite people who are listening along to participate in a poll. You have a chance to, on Zoom, you can find at the bottom of your screen a way to, actually now it's in the middle of the screen, and you can see the question there. This is the introductory polling question we're asking people, just to get a baseline sense of what people think about this core question. Do you think Confederate monuments should remain where they are? And of course, you have three choices there: yes, no, or undecided. We'll come back with the results of that poll in just a minute. But Susan, I want to begin with a bit of definition, because you and Jalane are using this term "working off the past," and that, of course, is what is described in that wonderful compound word with 26 letters and 8 syllables that marches across the tongue. Jalane, a gold star for you with your pronunciation, because I'm afraid to try, because I get it wrong each time. I'll try Verwagenheit. I know I messed it up already. I'm sorry. I do not speak German, so pardon me for that. But if you could explain what this word is, where it came from, and why it's called working off the past, not working through the past, not working from the past, but what that concept means.
So actually, the Germans have several versions of that word, Germans liking long compound words, and it's changed over time. When I first came to Berlin in 1982, the word that was most often used was Vergangenheitsbewältigung, which means conquering the past.
Okay.
And some people still use it. I don't, because it does imply that the past can be conquered and over and done with, and there's something easy you can do. And I don't think that's the case. I think
close the lid and say we're done with that.
Right. And the Germans are really not done with it, although I think they're several steps ahead of America. And America, by the way, if it makes you feel any better, is several steps ahead of the Brits. A year ago, The Guardian did a poll asking people asking British citizens how they felt about the empire. And only 19% of respondents thought there was anything to be ashamed of or sorry about in the British Empire. Now, that changed after the Black Lives Matter demonstrations last summer, which affected Britain, and there's been a lot of movement there, but it's still the case that they have a long way to go, as do the Dutch in their relation to the slave trade, as do the Belgians. It's hard because they didn't keep great records, but 10 million Congolese were presumably murdered when the Congo was a Belgian colony. So the US we're better off than you might sometimes think. We've made a start in the last 5 years. And I like to see, I like to think that there's a wave that's composed of a lot of different processes. But the word only means, looking at the parts of your past that you're not proud of is hard work. And nevertheless, it's work that you need to do. The German word for guilt is the same word for debt. And there is the idea that, if you work through or work off the past, there's a sense in which you can get to the point where you actually work off a debt that you have. But it's seriously hard work.
And can you say the word for us? We have audience members who want to be educated. Could you say the word?
Jalane was clearly practicing, so she did a pretty good job. But Vergangenheitsaufarbeitung. But I've lived here for a long time, so.
And at one point you said it also came to have a secondary meaning, which was essentially, what are we going to do about the Nazis?
That's my translation of it, because it was invented in the late 50s, and that is what it meant. Mm-hmm. Germans also they don't only like long compound words, they also like euphemisms. If you're cold and you want somebody to close a window, you don't say, could you please close the window in the room? You say, it's a little fresh in here. So they're
hoping that you get the message and that you get up but the compound word thing is interesting. I was reading something in the Washington Post actually about how during the pandemic there are a series of new compound words that have emerged to describe what people are going through. But this compound word is interesting because it talks about Germany, but there is a natural curiosity about what it might possibly mean for a country like ours, and you are uniquely positioned to actually draw this. It's not an exact comparison. It's not to say that slavery is akin to the horrors of the Third Reich. I mean, that's not, but to look at how one country dealt with a difficult past and decided to memorialize the victims instead of taking the tack that the United States has so often taken, is an interesting exercise. And you are uniquely positioned to do this because you are now living in Germany for many years. You've raised your children there, but you were born in the American South.
Right. And
you recently went back and spent a lot of time in the American South, in Mississippi, in particular, spending time with the good folks at the William Winter Institute. Mm-hmm. When you first decided to do this work, and you told people that you wanted to compare, that you wanted to look at Germany and suggest that there were lessons to be learned, how did people respond to you?
So it's very interesting. Germans either laughed or were appalled by it, because it is an axiom of being a good German that you say we committed the worst crimes that were ever committed, and we did some work in atoning for them, but we did too little too late, and nobody can ever learn from us. I think it's a very provincial view. I don't think it, I understand why they do it, because the Nazis compared their crimes to other people's, particularly the Americans. I mean, Hitler used the example of the genocide of native peoples and the theft of native lands in the United States as a way of saying, well, I can go colonize the Eastern Europe all the way to Vladivostok because other people did it too. And you see examples of that. So I totally understand that the comparison and other comparisons also to British imperialism were used by the Nazis as a way of avoiding responsibility, of avoiding guilt, and saying, everybody does it, so what's so bad if we do it? But I have to say, and I'm involved in several arguments at the moment in Germany about this, no two histories are ever alike. And I begin the book by talking about all of the differences between Nazi crimes and the crimes of Americans, not just during the slavery times, but during the 100 years thereafter, which I prefer to follow Brian Stevenson's term, the age of racial terror, rather than using the very common expression, Jim Crow, which I feel is also a euphemism that paints over what really happened during that time. So there are all kinds of historical differences, and they can be interesting from historical perspectives, different prejudices used against Jews and Black people and Asians and indigenous peoples. And those are all interesting to study if what you're interested in is history or anthropology. But I'm a philosopher, and what I'm interested in are the moral distinctions. And frankly, as soon as you persecute or murder a people in virtue of their belonging to that people, I don't see a moral difference. So this is something that I have to argue more in Germany, I think, than I do in the United States. When I decided to go to the US, because I had been thinking about how the Germans dealt with the Nazi period since 1982, when I first went there on a Fulbright fellowship, thinking I was only going to stay a year, and it turned into the majority of my adult life. But the question of whether or not I wanted to raise children in this country was a very real one. And in 1988, when my first child, my son, was 3 years old, I decided not to do so. Mm-hmm. I thought it just wasn't possible for a Jewish child to have a normal life in Germany. Mm-hmm. 12 years later, there had been a change of government and serious differences, a real attempt to nationally acknowledge what had been done in the past, to change the citizenship laws so that they were no longer based on Aryan blood, but on where you were born and where you lived, and various things like that made me feel, no, this is okay. I could raise, by that time I had 3 children. I could live here. I could have a normal life as a Jew. But I always felt like I was checking the temperature of the country, even if it wasn't a major focus of my work. I was following what was going on very closely. So when President Obama gave that speech in Charleston, I thought, wow, it's beginning, an American Vergangenheitsaufarbeitung, and maybe I can make a contribution to it. But I didn't simply want to preach from afar. I wanted to spend some serious time in the States talking to people who were working on changing our notions of histories and racial reconciliation. I focused on the Deep South, not because I think racism is not a problem elsewhere. We all know that it is, but I like to think that you can see things more clearly in the Deep South sometimes. And as it turned out, I got an invitation to speak at the William Winter Institute for Racial Reconciliation. I just loved the folks there and what they were doing, and asked if I could come back and use them as a base and follow their work, and then branch out to see what other people were doing in other parts of the Deep South. We're
doing this at an interesting time because it was, around the election, and so there were a lot of things that were surfacing in America.
Frankly, I am actually glad that I spent the, basically the almost the first year of Trump's term in Mississippi. I think had I spent it in Berlin or New York, I would have been in despair. And what kept me going was that even in Mississippi, there were so many people organizing immediately, organizing voter registration for the next election, visiting or bombarding their Congress people, working with immigrants who were being, horribly mistreated. So that work was, to see that was happening in deepest Mississippi really helped. It gave me hope that this was not the end, that it perhaps, and I believe, we don't know how history is going to turn out, but I actually believe that administration catalyzed something in the American people. Of course, the backlash is still there and it continued, but I think Charlottesville in particular showed Americans that Nazis are not just a German problem. And that made it very clear. So before that, people found it rather strange and even controversial that I would make this comparison. Americans found it controversial. There was an NEH fellowship that several members of the jury told me I was a shoo-in for, and didn't get because as one person wrote back, it was a tendentious comparison. Okay.
Okay.
But that was 2016. By 2019, when I had finished the book and my publisher had organized a very extensive book tour through the country, not a single person protested, because I think that the Trump administration galvanized people to realize this is a serious problem and we will learn from anybody we can, including the land of the Nazis.
So I want to, you explained very thoroughly in your preamble, but I just want to dig into that quickly a little bit more about how this happened, because we've had a chance to talk. I've been working on something on collective memory, and in that conversation, it became clear that there was no single epiphany that led to this. And often when you're looking at something that has produced such a sweeping change in Germany, you would expect that it was done by fiat, that there was a piece of legislation, there was one single opening of a grand memorial or a museum of something like that. And there wasn't. It actually was the planets almost lining up in a way that led to this collective decision to create a different kind of culture. And if we could just sort of tick through some of those things to help people understand. So part of this was German youth, that a generation that was raised by people who had seen the war and lived in the aftermath and were somewhat calcified and quite wounded because of it, raised children who didn't like what they saw. Help us understand how that contributed to the cultural change in Germany, where they came to a place where they were more willing to honor the victims and face up to the past.
So it's very true, and I've had the misfortune to meet some of them, that the war generation was really formed in a very authoritarian way. You hear stories. I don't mean to say that all the Nazis were monsters. You hear stories or read about they loved their children or they played music in the evenings or something. But the children tend to tell a different story. They tend to tell a very, and again, I unfortunately had to see this, a lot of coldness, just, rigid rules. Don't ask your father about the war, he suffered too much, corporal punishment in many cases, not what we would think of as warm, supportive families. And when the children became young adults, now various things were happening. First of all, you had two trials that were televised. One was the Eichmann Trial, which was very important for Israel and the US, less important in Germany. In Germany, a year later, there was a big Auschwitz trial in which people could actually see and found it hard to ignore how awful the concentration camps actually were. Then there was the fact that young Europeans who had the beginning of the EU and a certain amount of economic stability, so you could travel very cheaply. And that's something that, 18, 19, 20-year-olds love to do, or many of us still do. And suddenly realize that elsewhere, people hated Germans. And they would start trying to pass themselves off as Dutch or Danish just to avoid the kinds of hostility that they got both in Eastern and Western Europe, by the way. So that was a counterpoint to their parents' story that we didn't do anything worse than anybody else did. And actually, we suffered the most, and they had to have that information. You then had the publication of a number of books written by concentration camp survivors. In East Germany, you had quite a lot of film and television series, which you did not have in West Germany until the end of the 70s, when a quite awful Hollywood 4-part series called Holocaust, which is just awful, despite the fact that it has the young Meryl Streep in it. I tried to watch it, rewatch it recently, and I quit after about half an hour. But it made a huge impression on the German public because it was this kitschy story which somehow turned the number 6 million into the story of actual human beings and their families. And I think it's comparable to the way in which the television series Roots functioned around the same period, that suddenly it wasn't just, the numbers that you knew that people were enslaved, but the tearing apart of families because the daughter learned how to read. I mean,
and this happened
right.
at a time where there was not Netflix and Hulu. There were 3 networks. And so when it was on, it was really appointment viewing, and it had a massive international audience because people were much less distracted. Susan, there was also something that, so there was the people seeing how the rest of the world saw them. There was Germany trying to step back into the league of nations, as it were, and to shed this period of shame. And there were economic incentives that, German companies wanted to sell cars elsewhere and sell dishwashers elsewhere. And it was hard to do that when Germany had that stain. And there was this exhibition that was tantamount to holding a mirror up to society and asking people to look in that mirror. Can you talk a little bit about that exhibition and the role that played?
I certainly can, but that didn't happen until 1995. So that's actually quite late. Another thing that happened just before that, which I'd like to mention, were mostly young people who went out to try to dig up and restore the ruins of concentration camps, the ruins of the Gestapo torture chambers, and turn them into monuments. And this was not yet a state project at all. This was really a grassroots movement, or the Holocaust memorial that we all know that's in the center of Berlin, whether anybody knows who's read about this stuff. That started as a petition, an insistence that there be some national monument. And it was a grassroots movement that forced the state, which I think is good news when we're thinking about American projects and, how people can actually act together in order to force a nation to do the work it should do. The Wehrmacht exhibit in 1995 was made to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the war. And the interesting thing about it is that the organization, a research center that doesn't just focus on the Second World War, but other forms of violence in other parts of the world, thought that they would make a contribution to the 50th anniversary of the war by doing an exhibit of the war crimes committed by the Wehrmacht. The Wehrmacht was the German army. Depending on how you count it, there were about 19 million people involved in it. And what one needs to know is that there was a draft on. The only way to get out of the Wehrmacht was to do something worse, like be a concentration camp guard. So people had been able to say for a long time, well, it was all the fault of the SS, but my father or my, husband, was just serving his country. He had to do it. And all of the horrible things that happened were the results of the SS. People were somehow able to tell themselves that. Historians knew it wasn't true, but as we know, in the United States, what historians, for example, know about the age of racial terror or the short-lived Reconstruction is very, very different from what popular culture knows about those things. So the organizers of the exhibit were extremely surprised when they documented 3 cases of terror. And I think it's important and good that they did not focus on terror against Jews. They focused on terror against the 14 million Slavic civilians who were killed in Eastern Europe in the course of, occupying and colonizing Eastern Europe. They didn't talk about all 14 million, but they focused on these 3 highly documented cases, and things blew up. Because in ways that the organizers never expected. The exhibit was finally shown in 33 cities. In one place it was firebombed. In another place there were huge demonstrations with people carrying signs saying, my grandfather was a hero and not a terrorist. And then there were counter demonstrations. In the end, there was a consensus that this was a very important piece of national understanding, that you could not divide the terror into, a few bad apples and the rest of the country, that the Wehrmacht was a terrorist organization.
I want to talk a little bit about what we would see today when we visit Germany.
This is an interesting point that I want to add. The person who organized and funded that exhibit is a friend of mine. His father was not actually a member of the Nazi Party, but he was an old buddy of Hermann Göring's, and he had a monopoly on the cigarette industry in the Third Reich. So as my friend Jan Philipp puts it, my father was a war profiteer. He built a fortune through this regime and through his connections with the highest Nazi officials. And so the exhibit, but also other things that Jan Philipp has done, are a way of his figuring out. He inherited a foul fortune. What would be the honorable thing to do with it? And he's spent millions, not just on the exhibit, but on many other kinds of similar projects. And I met a little bit of that in the Deep South too, with people who actually wanted to make up for their ancestors' involvement in the slave trade by contributing to something now.
And you see that in places like the Whitney Plantation in Louisiana. Right. We have a lot of questions from the audience, but before we get to those, I would like you to talk a little bit about what you see in Germany today and just how ubiquitous the number of monuments are that honor the victims of the Nazi past. There are more than, is it 500 in Berlin alone?
I think it's 486, but I would have to look at my book. I did count.
Yes, it was a large number just in Berlin. And that
Right.
does not include the stumbling stones. You know, there are thousands in Berlin and all over the country. And as we talk about this, you know, try to imagine what this might look like in America. You know, if you had a stone outside of a building, say, you know, here lived Isaiah, you know, who was enslaved, you know, for this many years, born, worked, died, something of their history. So if we can just tick through a few of these are some of the stumbling stones. Susan, can you describe what we're seeing here?
Sure. These are little brass plaques that are placed in front of the last voluntarily chosen dwelling place of people, mostly Jews, but not only, who were deported and murdered. And each stone has to be done individually. Each stone has the name, has one name, date of birth, date of deportation, and date of death, if it's known. It's a very moving and very present reminder that, unlike a huge memorial, as wonderful as they can be, that you go out somewhere to see, that the violence began right in your neighborhood, right where you go to the market. Here were people who lived and were deported from that place. And I think it would be terrific if there were such a project. And I've actually, since I wrote the book, I've been approached by a number of people, and of course, who are thinking of similar projects also with Native American nations. And of course, Brian Stevenson was highly influenced by those memorials in particular in building his extraordinary national lynching monument, which eventually the columns that are made there will be taken back by the counties, and where the Equal Justice Initiative has documented a lynching and will be put there. And I think that would be terrific. I also agree with you that you know, projects that said, here was Isaiah, and we think he was born then and died then, and he helped build this building that is not just in the South, but you know, in New York City. Let me say also one thing that you don't see in Germany: you see no statues to Nazi heroes. Now, part of this is a bit of an accident, in the sense that the Third Reich only lasted for 12 years, and there wasn't a lot of time to build huge statues. And the occupation was long. There were, the Allies did put a law against showing any kind of Nazi symbols. There were swastikas all over the place, which they took down. Adolf Hitler squares and streets and so on, of which the names were changed, but they didn't have an awful lot of bad stuff to work with. And I have to say, when I was down south and in the middle of these monument discussions, I had to imagine what it would be like for me to live in a place where I and my kids still had to walk by old Nazi monuments, and I don't think I could have done it. There are a few still hidden away, but by and large, they're not. So what there are monuments like the thousands of stumbling stones that you just showed. This was a project, by the way, started, and still a private project, started by a German artist in the early 90s. And that was just his idea. And of course, it took off.
I want to move to audience questions, and maybe we will have an opportunity in doing so to share a few more of the pictures that you have, because the monuments are, many of them are beautiful and evocative. There's a lot of thought that has gone into how to, there really are of a great variety. But the one thing that I wanted to mention about the stumbling stones is that the community has to help raise the money for the stumbling stones, which is an interesting thing. It reminds me of the little libraries that you see in American neighborhoods where someone raises the money to place a library and they fill them with little books on a little stand that's, looks almost like a mailbox. Yes. But there's community involvement in that. And so you have just a large number of stakeholders, that are involved in this, and they feel like it's their monument. And in some ways they contributed to history. I want to take some of the...
Let me just add one more thing to that. And this is also something that Brian Stevenson, I gather none of the columns have actually been moved to the colonies, but this is going to be a condition. In Germany, it's not just that you have to raise 120 euros, which is really not all that much money for, certainly people can get together and pool it. It's about $135 at the current rate. They have to research the lives of the people who lived there. Otherwise, the artist will not do it. And I think that's very important, that they have to have more than a monetary stake. They also have to do some of the work.
So let's take a few of the audience questions. And Eleanor Baldwin has a very simple question. I'm going to try to get through as many of these as we can. Susan, what do you mean about educating the community, and how do we do that?
Well, one of the thoughts that I've had when people have asked me for concrete suggestions in the United States is run for your school board, or at least find out who's running for your school board and support them, because of course the school boards determine a huge amount of textbook content and lesson plans. And unfortunately, the people who have been paying attention to that stuff have not traditionally been Americans who are interested in Vergangenheitsaufarbeitung. And that would be the first way in which people could get involved, it seems to me. And my hope is that that becomes a kind of, as we're thinking about our history, that could become a massive, or at least a large movement of people saying, let's take control of the lesson plans finally, because they won't be changed unless we have a different consciousness. So that's one thing. Again, I think education goes through these discussion of monuments that I understand Jalane has really been doing in Charlottesville, Jalane and other people. That is, when you take down a monument, first of all, you find out a lot about the history. You don't think, as I thought when I was growing up, okay, people wanted to remember their fathers or their sons right after the war, and they put them up. And of course, as soon as you do a little digging, you realize that these were very conscious white supremacist movements to memorialize at very crucial points in which civil rights were being rolled back or threatened. And so you learn the history. And then you could also think about, in thinking about what you want to replace them with, you think about the values that you want to have in your community represented. And finally, again, popular culture is a huge force. Make a movie, make a play, write a story, go and interview older people in your families and learn about their histories, get them on tape. All of those are forms of community education.
And it's interesting, if you spend time in Germany, you will see that in film, in popular culture, in television. I mean, it really is part of the landscape. This question from Catherine Gill, and I'm not sure that I pronounced her last name correctly, so I apologize if I got that wrong, Catherine. But she says, you speak of those we should honor instead. A few Confederate officers worked towards reconciliation in the years after the war, notably Longstreet in New Orleans fighting the KKK, and Mahone here in Virginia, and the need to educate the freed slaves. While I am not sure either did so for the right reason, she says, certainly not by modern standards. Do you think that service in the Confederate Army means that they should never be honored? And is there any German equivalent to this kind of quandary?
That's a really great question. And the first thing to say is, we want heroes, we don't want saints. That is, heroes are complicated, and they're not one-dimensional, and they can have difficult pasts. If they genuinely do the right thing afterwards, then yes, I think they should be honored. And I don't know enough. I'm actually, my next book is going to be about heroism, and what makes up a hero. And I argue for, you really have to look at a person and her life very, very carefully to make that call. And so I'm not going to make that call about either of those people, but I certainly can imagine that if somebody did something like fighting the Klan and, working for the education of African Americans after the war, would they make if they made a couple of racist comments by today's standards, if they actually did something and put themselves on the line for it, I would be in favor of honoring them. As to the question about whether there are German equivalents, complicated. None of them occur to me offhand, I have to tell you, although certainly some of them were rehabilitated. For example, the president of Germany who made this sort of watershed speech in 1985, saying, we weren't just victims, we were also perpetrators, and we have to acknowledge that. Well, he'd not only been an officer in the army, he defended his father. I mean, he'd done a lot. And my, I guess that would be the best example of somebody who then did say, we moved on. I wish that he had actually issued an unequivocal statement. Not just the nation was wrong, I was wrong, my father was wrong, I think that's important in, making a real turn.
But he's remembered in a very different way because of that speech that he gave. Most
Absolutely.
definitely. Yeah, I want to call up the poll results before we go to this question from Robin Rivera. Now the question, remember, was, do you think Confederate monuments should remain where they are? You can see here 85% of people said no, 6% said yes, and 9% are undecided. This is Robin's question. She says, I wish the poll question could have given a fourth response, which would accommodate an option where if a monument is to stay, a monument for the victims and disenfranchised should be co-located. She says she saw a good example of this in Hamburg, Germany, where there was a large monument to the German soldiers of World War II. And she says, I understand that not all soldiers were Nazis, sympathizers or sympathizers, but the monument did not distinguish. And she says alongside was a large monument to the people who died at the hands of the Nazi regime. And she thought it was a unique response. Susan, you want to talk about that?
Yes, that is the one example. That's an important and interesting example. Now, the monument was actually built, the monument to the soldiers also was built for the soldiers of World War I, but it honored the people who were soldiers in the Wehrmacht in World War II, and the solution, after a lot of protest about taking the monument down, was to build this other monument. I don't actually think there are absolute rules for this. I think it should be a community decision, but I'm not easy with the idea of memorializing anybody who fought to, kill people on the basis of their race, or people who, fought to defend enslaving people on the basis of their race. I worry that there's a kind of false equivalence there, that, it's two sides and we have to honor everybody. And I mean, what we need to remember is that the monuments are not just about history. That's a false argument. The monuments are about values, okay? We don't make monuments to everybody in our history. We make monuments because someone did something that we want our communities to honor. And given that, I'm uneasy about the contextualization solution because I just don't think it's strong enough.
I just want to make a distinction because in America, the discussion that we're having and is largely around monuments. You know, men who are standing or sitting upright on horses. Many of the markers of some sort in Germany are actually memorials, as opposed to monuments. There are memorials to people, and you see where, you know, there's a lovely memorial where you look down and you see empty bookshelves, you know, in a hole in the ground to see, you know, to remind you of the books that were burned. And you're traveling along train tracks, you see shadows. In fact, why don't you explain what we're seeing here, the shadows that you see that are supposed to represent
people who are gone, people who were deported from that very train track, which was used for a lot of Berlin Jews being transported to concentration camps in the East. And that train track has been shut down and turned into a memorial, and the artist thought they were best represented by absences.
Mm-hmm. And then if we're able to do that, Sarah, thank you so much for throwing these up so people can actually see them. If you're able to see that, it looks like a glass panel in the ground, and you look down and you see these empty bookshelves, and they're to remind you of the books that were disappeared.
That's a different, I'm not sure that photo got.
Oh, okay. We're not sure that we have that, but just I wanted to make the distinction between monuments and memorials. Beth Widmark asked this question, having visited the memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe in Berlin, which is, you know, large and takes up a lot of space and is on prime real estate that developers were vying to get their hands on. And, you know, and it was decided, no, we're going to use this land to commemorate and memorialize those who lost their lives. She wonders if you believe that such a site might help heal America.
Absolutely. I think it's a scandal that there's not a monument to enslaved people on the Washington Mall. Whether it will do everything one would like a monument to do, I don't know. I'm in awe of the National Lynching Memorial in Montgomery, Alabama. I did get to see part of it when I was researching the book, but it wasn't completed. So I have a long interview with Brian Stevenson in the book, but I didn't actually get to see it until my book was done, and it was done. And then I now tell everybody wherever they live, it is worth the trip to Montgomery. It's extraordinary, but there should be something in the National Mall. There's no question about it. And I actually think it's Yiddish and German word Schande, which is scandal, that we had a Holocaust museum on the mall before we had a National Museum of African American History and Culture. You know, I say this as a Jew, but I sometimes think that the Holocaust has been used in the past in America to be a symbol of evil, to distract us from homegrown evil. And, you know, I think that's much less the case. And the other thing that I want to say, I really felt proud to be a part of a Jewish community when a number of Jewish and Holocaust-centered institutions, the Holocaust Museum in Washington invited me for a series of 3 talks, but there are Holocaust research centers all over the country. And after the Black Lives Matter demonstrations last summer, there was a sudden, you know, real interest among Jewish groups focused on the Holocaust to say, hey, tell us how the Germans have dealt with it. We realize we need to do something in America. So that's important to point out, but I certainly think there should be a national monument to slavery. Somebody who's a descendant of Thomas Jefferson actually proposed taking down his statue and putting up a statue of Harriet Tubman in its place in DC, which I think is one interesting idea.
Well, we're at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, where you encounter Thomas Jefferson on the ground floor pretty quickly when you enter the museum, and you meet him, but you also learn about some of the people who were enslaved at Monticello. So there is some. We have a question from Jessica Robertson. She says, my grandmother was a child in the Hitler Youth. She has many memories of wartime and has shared those with me. Her mother, 2 siblings, and her fled the war. How does familial memory and storytelling impact how we shape our identity and can, in fact, rewrite the wrongs of the past for the future? And thank you, Jessica, for that question.
Yeah, another excellent question. And, one has to say it really depends a lot on the family. Mm-hmm. One parallel that one saw in Germany between people whose parents were Nazis, and by the way, being in the Hitler Youth didn't exactly mean you were Nazi. It was sort of like the Boy and the Girl Scouts, and it was quite difficult not to join if you were 13, 14, 15. I don't know your grandmother's story, but it certainly doesn't mean that necessarily. But one parallel was that many people on both sides, both people who'd been Nazis and people who were victims of the Nazis, did not want to talk about it. Mm-hmm. In the one case, because of shame, mm-hmm. and in the other case, as one daughter of somebody who both of his parents survived Auschwitz said, I understand that my parents didn't want to talk about it. They did not want their children to have the burden of knowing that they had been powerless. Michele, I've ordered your book. I haven't yet read it, but mm-hmm. I did see a talk that you gave about, the ways in which mm-hmm. your parents did not want to put rocks in your pockets. Right. And it was only after President Obama was elected that you had this outpouring of discussion. And that's certainly, you see parallels in that in Germany, where sometimes people say their parents didn't talk about it and now they're looking into their grandparents' stories. And there's some people who go back and look at archives and try to figure out what actually happened because they don't entirely believe their families. So there's a lot of discussion of that. I think the few families where you had a sort of reasonably, a lot of families claim, oh, we were inner immigrants. We were always, silently opposed the Nazis. You can see in the few cases where that was actually true. A friend of mine, his parents really did hide a Jewish girl in their house throughout the war. She's healthier. She has a sense that she can be proud of her parents, that she came from a family that she can honor. It's good, but I love the way, I look forward to reading your book. I love the way you talk about the complications of passing on family stories.
Silence is its own narrative.
That's right.
When people choose not to talk, it says something in its own. I'm going to try to get to a couple more questions before we hit our end time. Bob Barnett says in the late 1990s, he was an adult leader with a group of Boy Scouts who toured the former East Germany, who toured in former East Germany as guests of, I should have my glasses on, I'm sorry, I'm reading small print, as guests of a German scout group. In stark contrast to scouting in the US, the German scouts rejected anything smacking of militarism, military style uniforms, insignia, ranks, saluting the flag, anything like that. And he says, as we hiked through small towns in the Harz Mountains, locals would occasionally call out to us, comparing us to the Hitler Youth movement while they were wearing American scouting uniforms. And he says, can you speak to the contrast between how militarism is actively rejected in Germany versus the way it is embraced and celebrated in the US, and particularly now by white supremacists and other right-wing groups in the US?
That's a really interesting story. And I can imagine that happening very, very clearly. In fact, Germans did not raise flags. I mean, you had to be a really right-wing German even to hold a German flag until we had the World Cup in, I think it was 2006. And suddenly, that was a really important moment that people felt, well, it's okay because we didn't quite win it, but we held it and we nearly won it. And so it's okay to wave a flag at a soccer game. There is a huge rejection of militarism and authoritarianism. As I said before, we do have a standing army, although one has to say there was a big move against it just after the war, and it was the American occupation who very much wanted there to be a West German army as a bulwark in the Iron Curtain. There was therefore also an East German army, which everybody had to serve in. We don't have mandatory draft now, but there is a real sense that military engagement should be avoided in almost every sense. I wish, and this is not something that the government has quite gotten its act together, because we still have a coalition headed by a conservative government. I wish we would get to outlawing weapons sales. I mean, I wish we would go after the weapons industry. But it hasn't happened yet, although Social Democrats call for it, and it hasn't happened yet. But there is a sentiment that we should not be producing or selling weapons either. And of course, you don't see any of that in the United States. But this is something that Brian Stevenson said first impressed him in Germany. He was giving a talk about trying to abolish the death penalty. And the Germans all said we couldn't possibly have the death penalty because of the Nazis. So the backlash, the correction, the working through the past has had an awful lot of repercussions or rippling.
A couple of quick questions. Someone, John Mitchum, wants to know, if you take down Confederate statues across the South, might downstream generations forget that the war and slavery ever existed?
What a great question, because nobody's forgotten it in Germany. On the contrary, first of all, we do have a museum for old statues that we don't want, and they're not just because there weren't a lot of Nazi statues, although there are a few of them, but there are a lot of militaristic Prussian statues from the First World War, and they were all taken down, and they're put in a museum, and they're placed in an interesting way. They're not on pedestals. Children are encouraged to climb on them. You're not supposed to look up to them. That would be a solution. But again, the important question is what we put in the place of the Confederate statues. And because Germany has memorialized so many other things, there weren't an awful lot of heroes, but there's some memorial sites for heroes, but there's sites for victims. I don't think you have to worry in the least that Americans are going to forget their history. This is where I think artists are called on. I think creativity is called on coming from communities. My hope is that there will be real community discussions. How do we remember this horrible time?
And part of the tension in the US, of course, are people who feel that their history, their heritage, their legacy is tied up in those statues that are being forcibly.
Yeah, but my answer to them, although I wish I could meet some of them, in person. Do you build a statue to your Aunt Mildred? I mean, maybe Aunt Mildred was a wonderful person, but we don't memorialize any old bit of our history. We memorialize values. And, this is a specious debate to say that it's about history. It's about values. And I think as soon as we get that, then we can stop those kinds of debates and stop worrying that we're going to forget our history.
Gordon Hellwig says, what has the German government done vis-a-vis reparations for the victims of Nazism? And can you compare that what they have done, if anything, and the debate about reparations in Germany to the debate about reparations in the US. I know this is a really big topic to ask at the end of our conversation when we don't have a lot of time, but if there is a
I'm
way.
just getting a note saying we have 1 minute.
Yeah.
I don't know if there's any leeway in that, but well, first of all, there's a chapter about that in my book. So if somebody's interested in reading it, they're welcome to do so. It's not, although I have an academic title, it's not an academic book. It's quite readable. It's written for a general audience.
And it is quite good. I invite everybody. You have an assignment if you have listened to this conversation. You really do need to read the book. And since we have more than 75 questions, clearly people are interested in this. And so they should read the book. I guess one way to ask the question in a quick way is, does the German model provide a lesson for America's discussion around reparations?
First of all, I think the cases were too different. And secondly, I think the cases, I don't think they did it well. So first of all, West Germany paid some reparations to the state of Israel in the 50s and to particular victims of the Holocaust. But it was coupled with this silence. There was this unspoken bargain. If we pay money, then we get to forget about the war. We get to forget about the old Nazis who are in our, all through the government. So it wasn't until we had a new change of government in 2000 that there was a new round of reparations that was coupled with the demand that there be education and, discussion of the war. So that's very important. Let's not,
again, another layered approach, another
That's right.
example of a layered
Exactly.
approach.
So let's not think that reparations would let us off the hook. But the very shortest version, because we have no more time, is that, yes, I think the United States owes reparations to descendants of enslaved people. I think there are interesting proposals on the table about exactly how that should be decided. It's an immensely complicated question. The Germans, let's say, can provide a moral example, if not in any of the details. The moral example is, it's really not enough to say, gee, I'm sorry, we shouldn't have done that. Something, if the root word of reparation is repair, something concrete needs to be done as well.
We had so many questions, and I regret that we couldn't get to many more of them. And many of them were also reflections. And so we are going to put in the chat a link that you can go to if you're interested in sharing more of your reflections at the Race Card Project. You can go to theracecardproject.com, and we have a special link that would allow you to share your recollections that are specifically linked to this conversation. And then we, of course, will share all of this with UVA and the Memory Project. So you will have that in your own arsenal as you continue to build this wonderful archive of memory and recollection and conversation as we continue. In saying thank you and goodbye, I just want to note one thing that you say in your book. You note that the most thoughtful Germans are reluctant to praise the process of working off the past because they're too aware of its flaws and its complications. So even in making the comparison, it should be noted that this is a long-term effort, that it is much like the striving for democracy. You're always chasing it, as opposed to perfecting it. And it's important to remember that. And the most important thing I think we can learn is that it was done in Germany. It provides an example of how you can look over your shoulder at a difficult past and acknowledge it.
I need to qualify. Yeah. The Germans made a big start. Mm-hmm. And yes, it's possible.
And that it can be a road to strength, as you say. Susan, it has been so wonderful to speak to you. Thank you so very much for sharing your wisdom with us. I hope that people are inspired, enlightened. I hope that they all read your book, and I hope that they all remain connected to Jalane's work with the Memory Project. Thank you very much.
Well, it's been an honor and a pleasure to talk with you, Michele, and I'm so glad that I've met you and ordered your book. And it's been Excellent. I hope somebody sends me the comments because it's always interesting to read, even if I didn't have a chance to answer everything. I was afraid that would happen, but thank you. And thank you, Jalane, for organizing this.
Absolutely. I want to thank our guests, Susan Neiman and Michele Norris, for taking this time to speak with us today and engage in this rich discussion. And as you've mentioned, there were lots of great questions that went unanswered. I think we need to have Dr. Neiman come to campus to grounds at UVA once everyone's had their vaccination and it's safe to travel, because this is definitely an ongoing conversation here locally and in the entire country. So I also want to thank. Oh, please, yes, that'd be great. Yeah. I also want to thank the wonderful staff of the Democracy Initiative, Jessica Kimple-Johnson, Sarah Ross, Ellen Oakes. They coordinated us so marvelously across time zones and tech platforms and everything. And so I want to say thank you for making this happen. And to our audience, look for a follow-up email from the Memory Project that will have further resources about these topics that we've discussed today, and also links to the Race Card Project that Michele Norris is doing, as well as information about upcoming Memory Project events. All right. Thank you for sharing this time with us here at the University of Virginia, and have a good afternoon, everyone.